Welcome to Older Militaries Radio TV, without phone Catholics, and we'll do this all for free and for love of Jesus Christ and for Holy Mother, the Church. And we will defend our Holy Mother, the Church. And today we're going to be talking about the second period of the foundation of the Church, part one, where we get into Constantine and Christianity becomes legal. And yeah, so we welcome Brother Alexis to the show.
Thank you, AJ, for having me on Automil Test Ready TV for this very unique series. We're briefly introducing the whole history of the church. And if you homeschool and you're a parent, this is a show to watch just to get yourself oriented so you can address all topics. Though this is not a detailed history course. So where did we leave off, AJ?
Talked about Diocletian and Nero and their persecution.
Yeah, so there were 10 bitter persecutions from the time of the martyrdom of Saints Peter and Paul at Rome, all the way to the last persecution called the persecution of Diocletian or the persecution of Decius. So there was the Diocletian, and the fathers of the church say the 10, just as there's 10, St. John the Evangelist in the Apocalypse said there would be 10 kings that would rise up against the church. And the last one would be like a horn pulled out with three sprouting up. And this is the prophecy of the 10 persecutions of the church, which took place. John saw it in mystical vision. The last one with three horns is the persecution of Diocletian, because there were three persecutions. He was dead set on exterminating Christianity. So first he had all the scriptures confiscated and burnt. Then he had the priests arrested and forced to offer sacrifice or put to death. Then he had all the known Catholics. And each persecution was like a year, 18 months after the other. And it was a horrible persecution. It killed a couple 100,000 Catholics around the empire. Diocletian retires and he puts four of his chief officers in command of the empire. And one is Constantine. And Constantine's mother was a Christian, Saint Helena. So she persuaded him not to put into practice the persecutions and hit the part of the empire he ruled. And I think his part of the empire, let me get it correctly, I think it was the West, France and England. And Decius wrote letters to Diocletian. He's not obeying you. He's not persecuting these people the way they're supposed to be persecuted. And that started the bad vibes between Constantine and Decius. Both wanted to be the head emperor, and a civil war broke out in the Roman Empire. And it came back down to the decisive battle of the Milvian Bridge at Rome, because the enemies of Christ controlled the city of Rome, and Maxentius, who was Decius's general there, and Constantine. And Constantine was on the west bank of the river, which is North Rome, and outside the city. And the whole city was walled and fortified. There was no one to get in. It's just the Milvian Bridge, which is 2 or 3 bridges upriver from where the Vatican is today. And it would have been absolute slaughter, because you'd have to put your 10 legions down this narrow bridge, and even if the enemy only had a few legions, he could hold you off and just mug you down. So they camped out. I think it was in the spring, I forget, but it was a cold morning. And as the sun rose, this very unusual meteorologic effect took place. When tiny ice crystals catch the light of the sun, they can form a big cross right in the morning sky as the sun hits it. And that's what Constantine's troops see. This is an extremely rare event. It happens like once a century somewhere in the world. It's pretty rare. And Constantine at that point wasn't yet a Christian. He was a worshiper of Mithras, the sun god. So were most of his troops. Uh, Thunder outside my window here. And it is reported that he heard, upon seeing this sign, in this sign you shall conquer, which has nothing to do with Mithraism. Okay, his memo also the symbol of the cross is also the symbol of the Mithric religion. So his men got really rallied, and they stormed that bridge, and they took Rome and defeated Maxentius. And the faction of Decius was destroyed. And immediately after, he published the Edict of Milan, which stopped the persecution of Catholics. And within 2 years, 305, he made it legal to practice the Christian religion. It was called the Christian religion back then. It's really the Catholic religion. And this totally changed the whole dynamic, because before, to become a Christian, meaning you would be put to death in your lifetime by some imperial persecution. Now you're not going to be put to death. Not only that, the emperor's mother is a Catholic. So in the next 60, 70 years, pretty much all the business classes, elites, educated classes with have members of their family who become Christians. And within 200 years, pretty much the whole civil society in the West converted to Christianity. The Roman society it was. So this, we're not talking about the pagans in the countryside yet, we're just within the cities. And it's from this period we have the first basilicas. The oldest basilica in the world, I think, is St. Mary's Major, which was built like in 315. St. John Lateran was built like in the 320s, endowed by Constantine and his mother especially. She went to Jerusalem, excavated Calvary, and found the cross and the relics of Christ. And she rebuilt Jerusalem. It used to be called Aelia Capitolina, had been destroyed by the Romans. It hadn't existed for 300 years. She rebuilt the city. She's rightfully called the refounder of the city, but you don't hear anyone say that today. They'll tell you that the Jews founded it. Well, actually, it was King David. But this changed the whole dynamic in the West. The Pope of Rome, which is the imperial capital, all of a sudden takes on a very influential role. It's at the end of the 4th century, when Christianity is made the religion of the empire by Theodosius, the Emperor Theodosius, that the Pope at Rome takes the title of the old pagan high priest to the city, which is Pontifex Maximus, because his duty was to quell the floods of the river and rebuild the bridges. Pontifex is bridge builder, because Rome is half on one side of the Tiber and half on the other, and the bridges are the economic life of the city. And that title gets taken up by Adrian, Pope Adrian I, who actually claimed the title of himself. And in the 6th and 7th century, started expanding the territory under which people were directly subject to the Pope. So this is a very big change. The Christian religion was persecuted, then it wasn't persecuted, and then it becomes a kind of an institution of the empire. The whole Roman Empire becomes Christian under Theodosius, and there's some emperors who are still pagan, like Julian the Apostate. He renounced Christianity. He tried to rebuild the temple, but fire came out in an earthquake and destroyed all his works. And he was captured by his Persian enemies, who I think made him drink lead, molten lead. He died a horrible death. And but very shortly after, in 476, the empire in the West falls. The barbarians take the city, sack it in 410, 415, and they destroy it with the last emperor. It's often said there was the last emperor was Romulus Augustulus in 476, but that's incorrect. Because though the empire no longer exists as an institution after 476, the title Roman Emperor does remain as a legal title, fiction. And you're going to see the great Roman Empire of the East, because in the East, the empire exists, it doesn't fall, and it remains Catholic. One of the greatest emperors was Justinian, who codified the legal code of Roman law, Justinian's code, which is the basis of law in most Mediterranean countries, even to this day. And it's the basis also of canon law. And he reconquered a third of the West during his reign. He was trying to restore the whole empire, take it back from the barbarians. He had some success, but not much. And his attempts to take back Italy destroyed the water supply of the city of Rome. And without the aqueducts, that was it. Rome was no longer a great city. It dwindled down to a little town of 50,000, and the aqueducts would never be repaired. And so he was a great emperor in one way, but he destroyed really the infrastructure of the Roman Empire in the West in his attempt to take it back. And the West becomes dominated by Germanic tribes who are either pagans or Arians. So the Arians believe that Christ was just a divinized man. He wasn't a divine being, or at least wasn't God. And takes the missionaries now, the Catholic missionaries in the West, trying to convert the Germanic tribes to the Catholic faith, or at least work out a living system with them. So you had, in Italy, you had the Vandals and the Huns and the Goths, and the Goths in Spain too. And the Germanic tribes came over the Rhine. The Franks took up dwelling in an area called Belgium, Lorraine. The Romans had to withdraw their legions from the British Isles, and they fell to the invasions of the Angles and the Saxons. And all while this chaos is going on in the West, the Eastern Empire remains standing. It will stand for another 1,000 years. And so they kept building up and beautifying their churches. They started having fancier liturgies. Their arts weren't destroyed. Literature wasn't destroyed. They kept civilization. Whereas in the West, you build a church and your grandson might see it sacked by the Goths or something, and everything's stolen from it. So the Western liturgy at that point, after the 5th century, just doesn't develop anymore, because books were burnt, chalices were stolen, churches were sacked, clergy were massacred, monasteries were, overrun. It was Benedict and his rule that organized the monks in the West and started little centers of learning, because he built his monasteries in very remote places. And so the army wasn't going to go on a 20-hour march uphill to chance finding one gold chalice in a poor little monastery. So that's how the Roman civilization in the West survives. And but most people lose any access to education, plumbing, healthcare, any kind of civil protection. And the Germanic lords in every little town start building their fortresses and castles, and they run the show. And the great blow in the West was the year 525, 535, when there wasn't a summer in the West for 5-10 years. There was no grain harvest, and there was mass starvation. And basically, to survive, you had to become a slave of a German lord in one of his castles. So the Roman Empire, which was freeman and almost wasn't republican because you didn't have the right to vote, it goes to being a feudal system. And if you have any relatives in Western Europe, you are alive today because your forefathers became the serfs of some German lord, or you're a descendant from some German lord. So mine were serfs, AJs who were overlords. And that's going to be the foundation of the new civilization in the West. And it was a very tumultuous period. The Roman Empire doesn't survive. Some things in Roman culture survive. The cuisine doesn't survive. Latin as a language dies out completely. Even in Italy, they speak Lombard version of Latin. Don't let any Italians tell you he speaks Latin. It's not the case. And it becomes a forgotten tongue. It's only kept in the liturgy, primarily because all the books that had been written were in Latin, and the priests felt safer to pray in Latin, the language that the barbarians didn't know what they were saying, so didn't get their throats slit. Um, that was kind of like a setting of the first, to answer your first question, AJ.
Uh, yeah, so did Constantine, did it come on?
Yeah, I should mention that Constantine calls the first council the Council of Nicaea, which defines that Christ is of the same substance as the Father. And that starts the whole tradition of the ecumenical councils in Christianity. And in the West, we define an ecumenical council as a council where the representatives of the Roman pontiff are present, and that represents the bishops of the whole world and intends to teach something dogmatically. Whereas in the East, they define it as a council that the emperor calls. So actually, for the Easterners, the last council is the Council of Florence, because the Greek emperor called that. But for us, the councils never ended because the Pope stopped calling. Constantine introduces Christian art. A very curious thing. You won't see any angels in art anywhere until the reign of Constantine. Under the reign of Constantine, angels appear in art for the first time. So that's a very unusual thing. You'll see his triumphal arches in Rome have angels on them. Whereas you look at the pagans know what an angel was because it's from the scriptures.
But when the Christian religion becomes legal in the Roman Empire, was it a good thing or was it a bad thing when the church begins to lose their ties to the original Eastern Christianity or the Eastern roots?
Okay, so during the time of persecution, you became a Christian because you personally believed, and it was a decision where you're basically choosing to risk your life. You were risking your life if you became a Christian. Once the religion becomes permitted, and then the official religion of the empire, you get promoted if you become a Christian. You pathways to education, political office, everything opens up for you. If you're not a Christian, it's all closed to you. So yeah, there starts to be a really big difference on the kind of Christians, and you see the early writers of the 5th century complaining about that. Augustine complains about it, where you have people who are, so we get our Christian in name only phenomena from. It goes all the way back to the 5th century, 4th, 5th century. And this doesn't mean all Christians are all good, obviously, but you will look at the Christians who were kings and emperors throughout the century. Not all of them are saints. Some of the Eastern emperors who were Christian, because they're all Christian after about 476. I mean, they're killing their brothers, stabbing the eyes out of their uncles and aunts. They weren't the good people. It never really changed the politics of the Eastern Empire. Christianity has had a very slow influence on politics and geopolitics. But with the collapse of culture in the West, you do have this break with Greek. So most people don't know that the Roman Church actually, in the beginning, its liturgy was all in Greek, and it won't change over to Latin until like the 3rd century. Whereas in the Eastern Empire, the official language of the state was Latin until like the 7th century when they start changing it over to Greek. Matter of fact, what we call the Byzantine Empire, the Empire of Constantinople, the Greeks in their language, in Greek to this day, call it the Roman Empire, except they wrote it in Greek. Okay, so if you're talking to a Greek Orthodox, don't call it the Byzantine Empire or the Empire of Constantinople. Say the Roman Empire. So it was. They inherited the empire and they kept it. The best way Greeks could, I suppose. But that means in the West, where at Rome there was a good Greek culture, under the empire, if you wanted your son to become a senator or provincial governor or some important tribune of the state, you'd send him to a Greek tutor who would teach him Greek and Latin, oratory, the great Greek philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, Stoics. You'd read Plotinus, you read all that stuff in Greek. We see this Augustine. Augustine read all these Greek authors. And even as late as the sixth century, the fathers of the church who are Greeks, like Saint Maximian and Saint Basil, they all studied Plato in Greek, you know. And but Greek was the liturgy even of all the Christians in southern Italy until like the 11th century. So there's a lot of people who could speak Greek, but Northern Europe had been brought into the empire by the Romans speaking Latin. So the knowledge of Greek almost became non-existent in the rest of the empire. And with the precariousness of piracy and trade, once you have the rise of Islam and they take all North Africa, there's pirates on the open seas. And before the Italian Republic, naval republics come into being in like the 10th, 11th centuries. You have very little trade by sea and such very little contact with Greek speakers. And the Greek speakers have very little contact with Roman speakers. And no one's teaching Greek anymore. Hey, they're not even teaching Latin anymore. So I think it was about after about 550s. You're not going to see almost any Greek influence in the Roman Catholic Church anymore. We still have the Kyrie eleison in Greek, and that's about it. Everything gets translated into Latin. Um, um, with Augustine, who wrote like 250 books in Latin, there's a whole new Latin literature, the fathers of the church. People have heard of Athanasius and Basil and Chrysostom, but they didn't read their writings in the Greek. The liturgy is St. John Chrysostom or St. Basil, which is the main liturgy in East is unknown of. There'll be monasteries where it's celebrated, but especially with all the persecutions going in the East for different theological reasons, constant monks were coming over and settling in Italy, but they couldn't teach their new vocations Greek, and after a while, the liturgy just went over to the Roman rite. So there was no liturgy, as I said, consequently, there's going to be no liturgical development. The Roman rite is just the bare bones of the liturgy. Everything that has to be, pretty much, not even that. It won't have the fancy vestments. It won't have the ornate rubrics. It won't have the movements around the church. It won't even have churches with art in it. They had cheap frescoes, pretty much, but that's more like in the 11th century, they start painting the interiors of the churches, as best we know. Obviously, in the fancy churches, still mosaics like at Ravenna. But things start falling apart and no one can repair them. A Byzantine ambassador who came in the 7th century to Rome, to the papal court, wrote back to the emperor and said, I asked them to show me their best mosaics. And the tiles they're using in these mosaics are so crude, you wouldn't find them in a bathhouse in Constantinople. Says, so don't even try diplomacy with these people. They're just barbarians. Rome no longer exists, he says. That was in the 7th century. And if you see some of the medieval kind of Gothic mosaic floor work, which occasionally is preserved in certain churches of Italy, you know exactly what it's talking about. I mean, every little piece isn't properly cut to a certain size. It's cheap colors of marble, and the mortar is irregular, so they're not even in imperfect places. Where, not like the Byzantines, where every piece there was huge pieces of marble that matched perfectly on the floor, and of the finest selections and stuff. So, the clergy in the West really aren't talking to the clergy in the East after the Second Council of Nicaea in the 7th, 8th century, and even the decrees of the ecumenical councils, the first 7, which were all in Greek, were unknown in the West because no one could read Greek anymore. They had like Latin versions of them, and even to this day, our Latin versions of them differ from the Greek versions, and it's like what was actually said at the council. That's how bad things got. So I have to pause just for a moment because I have to turn something off. Be right back, AJ. Okay, so I think I answered that question.
Yeah. How did the papacy begin to form a unity with this new Western civilization?
Okay, so after Constantine makes Christianity legal and Theodosius makes it the state religion, the Roman pontiff under Adrian, Pope Adrian, takes on the title of Pontifex Maximus and becomes a quasi institution in the empire. And so when the emperor is crowned, the emperor of the West is crowned, it's going to be the Roman pontiff who crowns him, who blesses him. And though the empire no longer exists, the title still exists, Emperor of the West. And you'll see that the emperors of Constantinople get quite upset when the Pope starts granting the crown to people who aren't Greeks, because there was a Lombard king of Italy, um, whose mother was the daughter of the Greek emperor, because for political reasons they married. His father married one of the daughters of the Greek emperor. So when he came to the throne in Italy, he asked the Pope to be crowned Emperor of the West, because his mother is the daughter of the Emperor of the East. And well, since the Lombards owned all of Italy except Middle Italy, the Pope said, okay. And the Greeks were like, what? No, we're the only ones who have the claim to the empire. You can't still found the empire again. You're just total barbarians. You're outside civilization. So relations with the Greeks start going downhill. And that's from the 8th century onward. And the popes keep up this practice. It finally kind of dwindles away because the Lombard kings become fools, idiots, drunkards, lechers, and they are Catholic, but they're not really so good. So that that's there becomes a general consensus in the West that the Pope can make you emperor if you get to Rome and get crowned. And no one really takes it that seriously until we get to the reign of Charlemagne. Charlemagne's going to take this seriously and change the course of history in the West. I should mention one of the big events in Western Christendom is the Islamic invasion of Spain. The Visigothic Empire is totally overwhelmed and destroyed in Spain. Just a generation after it becomes Catholic, converts to the Catholic faith. And Spain is almost completely taken except for a few isolated mountains in northern Spain. The Moors pour over into France. And if it wasn't for Charles Martel and his army, who had been in constant warfare for like 20 years all around Europe, putting down rebellions here and there in the Frankish Empire, if he hadn't responded, that would have been it. Paris would have been sacked. Most of France would have been sacked. And the Muslims would be there for a long time. But he defeated them in the Battle of Tours and put them to flight that they never came back into France. They never crossed the Pyrenees again in history, except for a little castle near Marseille or something like that. And so everyone in Europe starts looking at the Franks as the hope for the Catholic Church in the West, because it's the only ones with the military technology, the wealth, and the organization. And the Frankish Empire began with the Merovingian dynasty, who were pagans at the beginning, but were converted to the Catholic faith by Saint Denis, who baptized. I forget who was the name on the first Merovingian. They had Clodebert or something like that. They're very hard names to write. But the Merovingian emperors retired to their palace and let their major domo do all the work. It's like their chamberlain. And they end up losing all the power to the chamberlain, and one of these chamberlains has a son, and whose is Charlemagne, who then seizes the title of the King of the Franks.
Well, and next part was, well, well, since you talked about it all, there won't be another part. We'll get right into the Carolingian.
Okay, well, right before, the Carolingian Charlemagne, or Charles the Great was actually his name. Charlemagne is the Frankish for Charles the Great, and he was a big man. He was an ardent Catholic. He signed his name with this anagram in which he put a cross and then his letters on it. He made his capital at Aachen, which is currently in Germany. And his empire extended from northern Spain, where he built a shrine to Saint Michael and Altis, up there near Pamplona. And if you look out from the shrine south towards the Muslims' lands, there's this hillside in the shape of a sleeping dragon. It actually looks like a sleeping dragon, so they built a shrine of Saint Michael there. And all the way over to Saxony, he waged several wars. He conquered Saxony. He doesn't cross the Channel, but he does. The Lombards started harassing the Pope, and the Pope called for action. So he marches down to Italy and conquers northern Italy. And he conquers Croatia, Corinthia, and he goes as far as I think maybe Vienna up to there. So he owns this vast domain, the biggest state that had existed in Western Europe since the 5th century, 6th century. And he gets this inspiration. I want to be emperor. And the Pope says, the Pope, who was getting harassed by Muslim pirates, Lombard bandits, Greek mercenaries, he needs someone on his back on the north side of Rome who's going to take his cause. And he says, okay. And so on Christmas Day, near 800, this is an easy thing to remember if you remember anything of history. Christmas Day 800, at the I think it was at St. John Lateran's. I'm not quite sure. I think it was at St. John Lateran's, or maybe it was at St. Peter's. I'm not sure. He was crowned emperor of the Romans. And this is where we get the concept of the Holy Roman Empire. And the claim of the title Emperor of the Romans will be passed down from Charlemagne to the Artonians to the German Empire to the House of Habsburg, who claimed that title until 1918, I think. And it wasn't always the same government, the same state, or the same dynasty, but it was the same pretension to power. Not all of them actually controlled Rome, but usually they had great influence over the election of the Roman pontiff. And there, in the liturgy before the council in Latin, there are prayers for the emperor. And we're not praying for the Eastern Empire. We're praying for Charlemagne and his heirs, or the people that claim to the empire. And Charlemagne standardizes the Latin liturgy in the West. He asks for the Roman sacramentary from the Pope, and he has it copied all throughout, copied and corrected, and distributed to all the monasteries of his realm. He organized the roads. He's the first to have a standing army. He systemized taxation. He sent he commanded in every cathedral town there'd be a school to teach Latin. There was peace in this vast area, so the economy starts flourishing. Education starts flourishing, and this is the beginning of this is the true Renaissance. You're told the Renaissance took place in the 15th century in Italy or the 14th century in Italy, but no, this is the Catholic Renaissance. It took place with Charlemagne. And Charlemagne was a tough character. He had a brother who was a rival to his power, and Carloman, and he made him become a monk and sent him down to Mount Sorate here, which is not far from where I live, and right in the northern border of Rome. He appointed bishops. He made sure that there were honest men running the churches who weren't having a woman on the side. And he held many councils with the bishops to standardize clerical discipline. And he did so much for the church that for long centuries he was called a saint. And almost all the churches in Western Europe today that are dedicated to um, Saint Helena used to be called Saint Charlemagne and Helena, for both of whom had, because one was the mother of an emperor, the other was an emperor himself. Although that title's kind of fallen out of use. That Charlemagne's not called a saint anymore, at least after the council. And I don't think he was canonized, I think, by an anti-pope of Avignon. So it wasn't really an official Roman thing. Charlemagne had some children out of wedlock, so he wasn't a saint. But he was a great man, one of those men you put down, you add the word great to, and it's, not like putting great on John Paul II's name. I mean, what did he do? It's someone who really did something. If you wanted to compare Charlemagne to a figure in European history, you'd have to compare him to an antithesis. His antithesis is Adolf Hitler, who was a man of hate, destruction, pretended to be a Catholic, and destroyed Europe so that anything left fell under the Masonic power of England and the United States, where Charlemagne liberated Christian lands from pagans, defeated pagan tribes, and allowed the light of Christ to shine. And what he will do, bring the Christian religion into the dominant political position in Western Europe until at least you would say the French revolutions. So that's that's 1,000 years. Okay, so there's very few men in history who have an effect that lasts 1,000 years, and you can't say that of King David. You can't say that of Alexander. You can't say that of any Tsar of Russia, really. You can't say that really of anyone. He's a very, very unique figure. And for centuries, the church held him up as an example to all Christian rulers on how to run the kingdom. And not his illegitimate children part, but his statecraft, because he believed that Christianity had to be integrated into the statecraft of a kingdom, because it's a lot easier to govern when people are Christians. If people are pagans, they're going to be doing all kinds of vile crimes, murders, rapes,
Mhm.
perversions left and right. But if they're Christian, you don't need many laws, because it's, they already know the Ten Commandments. And uh, there were other kings before him who were Christian. Armenia is the first king that was Christian. But Charlemagne weds the two together so well that you can't really talk about monarchy in European history apart from Christianity. It's just, there was once a thing and there isn't a thing. So and so much so that the enemies of Christ today, they hate the word monarchy, and that's because of Charlemagne. Because Charlemagne placed monarchy under the cross. The crown is under the cross, and um, you can't underemphasize the influence of Charlemagne and what he did, and we should all be thankful. But there are people say, "Oh well, in Europe, everyone's a descendant of Charlemagne now." That, well, if you're a tard, maybe you don't, but it's not, because Charlemagne's descendants all died out, and so through female lines, there's still some of them. Yeah. There's one running a radio station out in Kansas, two female marriage lines. So AJ's related by marriage.
Yeah, and if
Um,
anybody's going to the wake and funeral and the of the heretic pope, and if you see a red dot in St. Peter's Basilica, that is the actual red dot where he knelt and was
okay, yeah,
crowned.
okay. Sorry, AJ, I forgot it was St. Peter's Basilica. Next time I'm in there, I'll go and look, but I'm still waiting for them to reconsecrate it after the Pachamama
Mm.
sacrilege. Yeah, Charlemagne, if Charlemagne was alive today, he would go to that funeral tomorrow and probably take his sword out and hack the coffin too.
Mm-hmm.
He could not stand heretics. He had no tolerance. And
And,
his example will inspire Catholic leaders in Europe for 1,000 years to realize that being strict on the Catholic faith, on the Christian religion, is the most prudent and safest course for a head of state. And we need to get back to that.
Yeah, it's another inspiration of the Catholic Party for America, which everybody hates.
Yeah, if you're listening to anyone on social media who is telling you anything about the Catholic faith, whether they're laymen, religious, or priests, even bishops, even
Mhm.
cardinals, there's really no guarantee these people are telling you the Catholic faith anymore, because most of them accept the Masonic idea that the best form of government is a liberal democracy, and that's not a
Mhm.
Christian idea. Because in a democracy, the majority get what they want, whether it's right or wrong, and that's demonic. It's not a Christian democracy would outlaw everything that's against the Ten Commandments, and the legislature couldn't pass such a law. But that's, only true Catholics believe that. It's what a democracy should be. The others are all into liberal democracy. And you can see because they'll follow their heads of state. They'll say masses for him, even though he's a Mason, a Satanist, you know. They admit Macron to communion, even though he's married to his father. You just hear most absolute horrendous things. Oh,
Yeah.
and I heard it. I heard it from someone who went to mass with how the Anglicans, some of them came back into the Catholic faith a couple of years ago under Benedict, about 10 years
Uh-huh.
ago. So they went to one of these masses figuring this priest is going to be conservative. You know what he said? Now that Pope Francis is dead, we have someone in heaven to answer our prayers.
Oh boy.
I had a friend who tells me this. So I told my friend, if we get a Catholic Pope, name the priest to the Holy Pope, because this guy needs to be kicked right out of the Catholic Church. That's how audacious blasphemy you can possibly say that a man who said Our Lady wasn't a saint, that the Gospels didn't record the words of Christ. Oh, and the Our Father was wrong. He had to correct it.
Mm.
Is in heaven? Yeah, yeah, sure. So we're in a world upside down now because of Freemasonry, because of the influence of the Rothschilds through the Pilgrim Society, who have infiltrated most of the churches and turned them into Zionist organizations. And so that in politics, almost no Christian acts like a Christian anymore. And most Christians will burn in hell for the way they vote because they're voting for the Antichrist almost every time, election after election, because all the parties out there are Antichrist. And Christians need to found Christian parties. But as soon as you do, all these voices I've been talking about, they'll all attack you viciously. Oh, that will never succeed because they don't believe in Jesus Christ.
Mhm.
Charlemagne believed in Jesus Christ. He consecrated when he was crowned emperor by the Pope, he consecrated his entire empire to Jesus Christ. He entrusted his power to Jesus Christ. He entrusted his people to Jesus Christ. And that's what made him great. And that's why the dynasty of the Capetian dynasty, which will come out of his court. It's not directly blood related to him directly, but indirectly, will rule France for 1,000 years,
Mhm.
and other parts of Europe too. And this is the prudent thing to do. Even our own families, we should consecrate ourselves to Christ, our families to Christ, our houses to Christ. So we should put all our power and influence under the authority of Christ. That's the only way you're going to lay down a foundation that lasts. And all these other people who tell you to trust in Freemasons, who are their heads of state or their politicians, whether they be conservative or not, communists or nationalists, whatever, these people are Freemasons because they're telling you to give power to the enemies of Christ.
Oh, so hope you like today's episode. We'll share it and I'll try to put this one up on YouTube on our original channel. We got the first two up there. We'll also put it on Rumble, Odyssey, and BitChute and the website. And want to play a board game on this. There is a board game. I'll link that in the show page.
Okay. The Ottonian Empire. Okay. That's one of AJ's favorite board games. Okay.
Yeah, this is Order Militaris Radio TV signing off. That is full.
Deus Vult.